"Do you ever wonder," André Rieu asked the packed Carnegie Hall audience, "what dreams sound like when they've been buried for 70 years? The question hung in the air like a suspended note, creating an almost electric silence in the Golden Concert Hall. 2,000 people had gathered that evening for André Rieu's presentation of classical masters through the centuries. The ornate venue gleamed under the crystal chandeliers, and the atmosphere was charged with anticipation and reverence for what promised to be an unforgettable evening. André Rieu stood behind the curtain, listening to the murmur of the crowd. After all these years, he still felt that familiar flutter of nervousness mixed with excitement. Tonight he would perform works by Bach, Mozart, Beethoven, and Brahms, pieces that formed the foundation of everything he believed in. "5 minutes, maestro," whispered his assistant. André nodded and cast a final glance at his beloved Stradivarius. The instrument gleamed in the soft light, ready to come alive under his hands. When the curtain rose and he stepped onto the stage, he was greeted by thunderous applause. He bowed elegantly, looked out over the sea of faces, and began, as always, by letting his gaze wander through the hall. It was a habit of his. He wanted to truly see his audience, to feel a connection with everyone present. The front rows were filled with the usual faces, prominent culture enthusiasts, donors to Carnegie Hall, music critics in their finest attire. But when his gaze moved up to the cheaper seats in the balcony, he noticed something that made him pause. There, in one of the back rows of the upper balcony, sat an elegant, elderly lady alone. She wore a simple but tasteful navy blue dress and a pearl necklace that was clearly of sentimental value. Her grey hair was neatly styled, and though she must have been at least 82, she sat perfectly straight in her chair. But it wasn't her age or her clothing that caught André's attention. It was the way she looked at him, not with the passive admiration of an ordinary concert-goer, but with the intense focus of someone who understood every nuance, could appreciate every subtlety. "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen," André began into the microphone. "Tonight we take you on a journey through 3 centuries of musical excellence." As he spoke, he saw how the elderly lady folded her hands in her lap. But it was the way she did it that fascinated him. Her fingers moved as if they remembered the position of violin strings, as if they were reacting from muscle memory to what she heard. The Johann Strauss Orchestra played the opening notes of Bach's air on the G string, and André began his solo. But even as he played, his attention remained partly focused on the lady in the balcony. She followed every note, every phrase, her head moving with the music in a way that revealed she was more than an ordinary listener. Halfway through the piece, something remarkable happened. André saw how her left hand discreetly moved, fingers positioning as if she were playing along on an invisible violin. It was a subtle movement, probably unnoticed by everyone except someone who knew what to look for. When the first part of the concert ended and the applause died away, André made an unusual decision. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice echoing through the quiet hall, "before we continue, I want to say something." The hall became dead silent. This wasn't part of the planned program. André set down his violin and looked directly at the balcony where the elderly lady sat. "Music," he continued, "is a universal language that connects us all. But sometimes, very rarely, you see someone in the audience who doesn't just understand that language, but speaks it at a level that touches your heart." Mrs. Zelma Whitmore, for that was the lady's name, felt all eyes turn toward her. She tried to hide behind the person in front of her, her cheeks red with embarrassment. "Ma'am, in the balcony," André continued kindly, "I see how you follow the music. May I ask if you play an instrument yourself?" Zelma shook her head vigorously and tried to gesture that he should continue with the concert, but André wasn't about to let it go. "I'm sorry that you have to sit so far away," he said, pointing to her seat in the very back. "Would you perhaps like to come down? I have the feeling that you should experience the music up close." A wave of murmurs went through the audience. This was unprecedented, André Rieu interrupting his own concert for an unknown elderly lady. Thaddeus Whitmore, Zelma's grandson, who sat next to her, whispered, "Grandma, this is a unique opportunity. Go with him." "No, Thaddeus," she whispered back. "This is embarrassing. Everyone is looking at us." But André had already stepped off the stage and was walking toward the stairs leading to the balcony. The entire hall watched breathlessly as he climbed the steps. "Ma'am," he said when he reached her, It would be an honor if you would attend the rest of the concert from up close. I saw how you follow the music, and I have the feeling that you have a story that needs to be told." Zelma's eyes filled with tears. "Mr. Rieu, you don't understand. I could only afford the cheapest ticket. I don't belong here at all." "Music knows no class distinction," André interrupted her kindly. "Talent and love for music are the only qualifications that matter." Hesitating with Thaddeus's encouragement, Zelma stood up. The entire audience applauded as André took her arm and slowly escorted her down to one of the front row seats. "There," he said when she was seated. "Now you can feel the music as it's meant to be felt." When the concert resumed, André saw how Zelma transformed. From her new position, she could see every detail, follow every movement of the musicians, and what he saw confirmed his intuition. This woman understood music on a level that went much deeper than that of an ordinary listener. During intermission, he approached her. "Mrs. Whitmore, Zelma Whitmore. Mrs. Whitmore, may I ask where you had your musical training? I see how you follow the pieces, you anticipate the modulations, you feel the rhythm changes before they happen." Zelma smiled sadly. "That's very kind of you, Mr. Rieu. I did indeed play violin in my youth professionally." There was a long silence. Zelma looked at her hands, old hands that had once been so nimble. "Where did you study?" asked André softly. Zelma hesitated, her gaze wandering through the hall as if she were looking for an escape. "That was very long ago, Mr. Rieu. Things that are better left in the past." "But why? Your love for music is clearly still so strong." "Some dreams," she said with a voice full of long-buried pain, "are meant to remain what they are, dreams." André sensed there was much more behind her words, but he didn't want to push her. Not here, not now, with so many people around them. "Perhaps," he said softly, "you could stay after the concert. I'd like to hear more of your story." Zelma looked at him with eyes that were both grateful and fearful. "Mr. Rieu, you're very kind, but there are stories that are better left untold." When the second half of the concert began, André played with an intensity that surprised even his own musicians. He played for the entire hall, but his heart played for the elegant lady in the front row who carried a secret he didn't yet understand. And as the last notes of Brahms' violin concerto echoed through the hall, André knew this wasn't the end of their story, but just the beginning. After the concert, while the audience slowly streamed out and the musicians packed their instruments, Zelma remained seated in her front row chair. She stared at the empty stage as if trying to etch every detail into her memory. André had put away his Stradivarius and came to her, accompanied by Thaddeus, who nervously fidgeted with his hands. "Grandma has always had a special relationship with music," Thaddeus said carefully, "but she never talks about it. In the past, when I was little, I sometimes heard her crying in her room at night, and then my mother would say that Grandma was sad about the music." André looked at Zelma, who was still staring at the stage. "Mrs. Whitmore, may I ask why music makes you sad?" "It doesn't make me sad," she said softly. "It reminds me of who I once was, or rather, who I could have been." "And who was that?" Zelma finally turned to him. Her eyes were clear, but there was a deep melancholy in them. "Someone who believed that talent was enough. Someone who thought that passion could overcome all barriers." She paused. "I was young and naive." André sat down next to her. "Tell me about your youth. When did you start playing violin?" "At age 8. My father found an old violin in my great-grandmother's attic. She apparently also played music. The first time I drew the bow across the strings." Her eyes lit up at the memory. "It was like coming home." "And then it became clear that you had talent?" "My parents, who were really ordinary workers, saved every cent to give me lessons. Mr. Peterson, the local violin teacher, said he had never seen such natural technique in a child. Even Dr. Margaret Thornfield, the musicologist from Lincoln Center, who heard me play, said I was exceptional. Dr. Elizabeth Thornfield, the musicologist from Carnegie Hall, who had overheard the conversation, came closer. "Excuse me," she said politely, "but I couldn't help overhearing. May I ask what period this was?" "The late 50s, Zelma answered. 1957 to be exact." Elizabeth nodded. "An interesting time for the American music world. A lot was happening after the war." "Yes," Zelma said bitterly. "A lot was happening for some people. At least." André saw the pain in her eyes. "What happened, Mrs. Whitmore?" Zelma stood up abruptly. "I think we should go home, Thaddeus. It's getting late." "Grandma, please," Thaddeus said softly. "Mr. Rieu is interested in your story. That doesn't happen every day." "There is no story," Zelma said curtly. "Just an old tale about a girl who dreamed of things that weren't meant for her." André felt he had to be careful. "Mrs. Whitmore, if I may ask, where did you study after your first lessons?" "The conservatory," she whispered. "The Manhattan School of Music. I was one of the youngest students ever admitted." Elizabeth's eyes widened. "Which department?" "Classical violin. I was one of the most promising students they'd ever seen." "That's extraordinary," said André. "The Manhattan School is still one of the most prestigious institutions in the world." Zelma laughed, but it sounded hollow. "Prestigious? Yes, for the right people." "What do you mean?" There was a long silence. Zelma seemed to be fighting an internal battle between the desire to tell her story and the fear of what that would mean. "Mr. Rieu," she said finally, "you are a man in a world that was always open to men. You cannot imagine what it was like for a woman in the 1950s who dreamed of a career in classical music." "But surely not impossible?" asked André. "Not impossible? No, but strongly discouraged. Very strongly discouraged." Elizabeth leaned forward. "May I ask who your professor was?" At this question, Zelma stiffened completely. Her face went pale and her hands began to tremble. I don't think it's wise to mention names." "Why not?" asked André softly. "Because some names are better left unspoken. Because some memories are too painful to recall." Thaddeus put his hand on his grandmother's arm. "Grandma, whatever happened, it's over. You can talk about it." "No," Zelma said with a strength that surprised everyone. "I can't talk about it, and I won't talk about it." She stood up and began walking toward the exit, but her legs weren't as strong as they once were. She staggered and would have fallen if André hadn't caught her. "Careful," he said as he supported her. For a moment she leaned against him, exhausted by the evening's emotion. And in that moment of vulnerability, she whispered something only André could hear. "I wasn't good enough. At least that's what I was told over and over and over again." André felt his heart contract. "Who told you that?" But Zelma had already recovered and freed herself from his grip. "That doesn't matter anymore." "It's ancient history." "Is it?" asked André. "Because the way you followed the music tonight, the way your hands moved, that doesn't seem like ancient history to me." Zelma looked at him with eyes full of tears she refused to let fall. "Mr. Rieu, there are things in life that you can never completely bury, but that you can never fully embrace either. Music has become such a thing for me. But why? Because every time I hear a violin, every time I attend a concert, I'm reminded of everything I could have been. And that's a pain I've learned to endure, but not to overcome." Elizabeth, who had been listening quietly, suddenly came up with an idea. "Mrs. Whitmore, would you object if I did some research into your time at the conservatory for historical purposes?" Zelma's reaction was immediate and vehement. "No, absolutely not. Leave the past alone." The force of her reaction startled everyone. It was clear there was more pain behind her refusal than she wanted to reveal. "Grandma," Thaddeus said softly, "maybe it's time to what? To open old wounds, to humiliate myself again." Zelma's voice broke. "I've had 72 years to make peace with what happened. Don't ask me not to do that now." André saw the despair in her eyes and made a decision. "Mrs. Whitmore, no one will force you to do anything you don't want, but know that if you ever want to tell your story, there are people who will listen and who will make sure it's received well." Zelma looked at him for a long time. "Mr. Rieu, you're a good man, but there are stories that are better left untold for everyone's sake." As Thaddeus escorted his grandmother to the exit, André and Elizabeth looked at each other. "Something happened," Elizabeth said softly. "Something that hurt her deeply. And I'm going to find out what it was," André replied with a determination that surprised both Elizabeth and himself. The next morning, André sat in his study, but his thoughts weren't on the sheet music that lay before him. The image of Zelma, her pain, her refusal to talk about the past, the way she shrank back at certain questions, it wouldn't leave him alone. He picked up his phone and called Elizabeth Thornfield. "Elizabeth, about last night." "I can't let it rest." "Neither can I," she answered immediately. "There's something fundamentally wrong in her past. The way she reacted to the question about her professor. Can you do some discreet research? I don't want to hurt her, but I have the feeling an injustice was committed that still causes pain." "I've already started," Elizabeth said. "I have access to the conservatory archives. Give me a day." Meanwhile, André wrestled with his own feelings. Why did this woman's story touch him so deeply? Perhaps because he himself had had the privilege of pursuing his dreams in a world that accepted him, while she had apparently been pushed away by forces he couldn't understand. That afternoon, Elizabeth called back, her voice tense with excitement and indignation. "André, you need to hear this. I found Zelma Whitmore in the archives, and what I discovered is shocking. Tell me." She wasn't just a student, she was a prodigy, a phenomenon. Her file is full of superlatives from her early professors. Extraordinary talent, natural virtuosity, one of the most promising students in decades. André felt his stomach turn. And what happened then? In 1959, her third year, everything changed. A new violin professor came, Professor Augustus Blackwood, a man with a, let's say, controversial reputation when it came to female students. "What do you mean?" "I found newspaper clippings, André. Zelma gave a recital in 1958 that was described as brilliant and breathtaking. The New York Times critic wrote, 'Miss Whitmore plays with an emotional depth and technical perfection that even experienced professionals would envy.'" André was silent, processing what he heard. "But then," Elizabeth continued, "a few months later she suddenly stops. No graduation, no farewell recital. She just disappears from the conservatory. Did she ever give an explanation? Not officially, but I found a letter in the archive. A letter from her father to the director asking for his daughter's tuition back because she had discovered she wasn't suited for a professional music career. That makes no sense, not after such reviews." "Exactly, and there's more. I found 3 other female students who stopped in the same year, all from Professor Blackwood's class." André felt anger bubbling up. "What else did you find out?" "I looked up Augustus Blackwood. He's still alive, André. He's 94 and lives in a nursing home in Westchester County." That afternoon, André and Elizabeth drove to Westchester. Augustus Blackwood was a thin man with clear eyes, who still radiated the arrogance that had probably been his trademark. "Zelma Whitmore," he said when André mentioned the name. "Of course I remember her." "Sad case." "Sad?" André asked. "Too emotional. Women have a tendency to approach music too emotionally. No discipline, no objectivity." Blackwood shook his head. "I tried to help her, but in the end, I had to conclude that she just didn't have the right material for a professional career." André felt his hands ball into fists. "Despite the brilliant reviews?" Blackwood laughed dismissively. "Reviews written by sentimental journalists who let themselves be carried away by a pretty face and a heartbreaking story. Real music evaluation requires objectivity. And you were objective." "Absolutely. I made it clear to her that a woman in classical music can only be successful as a pianist or singer. Violin is a masculine instrument that requires strength and authority." Elizabeth couldn't contain herself anymore. "Professor, how can you say such a thing? There were successful female violinists in the 1950s. "Exceptions," Blackwood waved away, "and usually not at the highest level. I did Zelma a favor by letting her stop early before she would waste years on an unrealistic goal." André stood up. "A favor? You destroyed a generation's talent." "I taught realism, and ultimately I was right. Where is she now? If she had really been as talented as you suggest, she would have found a way to continue anyway." Outside the nursing home, André stood trembling with rage. Elizabeth laid a calming hand on his arm. "Now I understand why she doesn't want to talk," she said. "Decades of believing she wasn't good enough, when in reality she was the victim of systematic prejudice. We have to go back to Zelma," André said with determination. "She needs to know the truth. But will she want to hear it? Sometimes the pain of lost dreams is easier to bear than the anger over stolen dreams." André looked at the sky where dark clouds were gathering. "She deserves to know that she was right all those years, that she really was good enough. That evening, André and Elizabeth stood in front of Zelma's modest row house in Queens. Thaddeus opened the door, his face worried. "My grandmother doesn't want to see anyone," he said. "She's been in her room all day and refused to eat." "Thaddeus," André said softly, "we have information about your grandmother's time at the conservatory, information that could change her perspective. She doesn't want to hear anything about the past. Even if that past is filled with lies that have determined her entire life." Thaddeus hesitated. "What lies?" André and Elizabeth exchanged a glance. "May I tell him?" asked Elizabeth. André nodded, and Elizabeth explained what they had discovered. The brilliant review, the sudden change after Professor Blackwood's arrival, the pattern of female students who quit. Thaddeus's face grew paler. "Do you mean that that she really was as good as she always claimed?" "Better than good," said André. "She was extraordinary. A true talent that was taken away by prejudice and arrogance." "But why has she never said that? Why has she let us believe that she just wasn't good enough?" "Because," said a weak voice from inside the house, "I came to believe it myself." Zelma stood in the doorway, her eyes red from crying, but her posture straight. "Grandma," Thaddeus said softly. "I heard you," she said. "And maybe it's time I face the truth." Zelma let André and Elizabeth into her simple but tasteful living room. The space breathed music. Photos of famous composers were everywhere, and in the corner stood an old piano that was clearly played regularly. "I heard what you told Thaddeus," she began, her voice still shaky from emotion, "about Professor Blackwood, about the reviews." She sat down in an old armchair, her hands folded in her lap. "I had hoped I would never have to hear that name again." André and Elizabeth sat across from her. Elizabeth took out a folder. "Mrs. Whitmore, may I show you something?" Zelma nodded hesitantly. Elizabeth opened the folder and took out a yellowed newspaper clipping. "This is from the New York Times, March 15, 1958, a review of your recital." With trembling hands, Zelma took the clipping. Her eyes slid over the words she probably hadn't seen in 72 years. "Miss Zelma Whitmore gave a recital last night that may be called this season's highlight," she read aloud, her voice barely a whisper. "Her interpretation of Bach's Partita in D minor was of a technical perfection and emotional depth that even experienced professionals would envy. Here we hear not just a gifted student, but a true talent destined to enrich the American music world." Tears now flowed freely over Zelma's cheeks. "I had forgotten this," she whispered. "I had forced myself to forget it." "But why?" asked André softly. Zelma put down the clipping and looked out the window at her small garden. "After that review, I was so happy. I thought my future was certain. My parents were so proud. They had sacrificed so much for my lessons. And then Professor Blackwood came," Elizabeth said softly. Zelma nodded, her face contorting with pain. "He took over from Professor Johnson, who retired. I was so excited. Blackwood had an international reputation. I thought I would learn from the best." "What happened during your first lesson with him?" asked André. "He had me play the same Bach Partita that had been praised so much in the newspaper. When I was finished, he looked at me and said, 'Miss Whitmore, who taught you to play so emotionally?'" Zelma's voice became bitter. "Emotionally, as if it were a disease. And then he said that women had a tendency to sentimentalize music, that true virtuosity required objectivity, something women were incapable of by definition." Zelma stood up and walked to the window. I tried to explain to him that emotion and technique could go together, but he laughed at me. Elizabeth shook her head in disgust. How could he say such a thing to such a talented student? "That was only the beginning," Zelma continued. "Every lesson became a humiliating experience. He made me repeat the same passages endlessly, said my interpretation was typically feminine and weak. He constantly compared me to his male students who, according to him, had natural authority." André felt anger rising within him. "And the other professors, did they do nothing?" "Professor Blackwood had a lot of influence, and in those days women didn't complain. We accepted what we were told." Zelma turned around to them. "After 6 months, he said I should consider switching to piano because that was more suitable for women. When I refused, he became crueler." "How crueler?" "He started preparing me for orchestra auditions, but then he sabotaged me. He chose pieces he knew I couldn't play well, gave me wrong information about what was expected of me. Zelma's voice broke. With every rejection, he said, "See, I warned you that you weren't strong enough for this world." Thaddeus, who had been listening quietly, asked, "But Grandma, why didn't you go to someone else?" "To the director." Zelma laughed bitterly. The director was Blackwood's friend. Besides, who would believe a young girl against such a respected professor? Elizabeth took more documents from her folder. "Mrs. Whitmore, we found evidence that you weren't the only one. Here are the names of 3 other female students who stopped in the same year." Zelma looked at the names. Marianne Stevens, she was a brilliant cellist, and Johanna Baker, she played piano like I'd never heard. Her voice became softer. "Were we all driven away by the same man?" André confirmed. "And all of you have believed your entire lives that you weren't good enough." There was a long silence. Zelma sat down again, suddenly looking old and vulnerable. 72 years, she whispered. 72 years I've believed he was right, that I was fooling myself about my talent. "But that wasn't the case," André said emphatically. "You were brilliant. You still are brilliant. I saw it last night in the way you followed the music." Zelma looked at him with eyes full of confused sadness. "But what should I do with this knowledge now? I'm 91 years old. My life is over." "Your life isn't over," André said with determination, "and your talent is still there." "Nonsense. I haven't touched a violin in 72 years. "When was the last time?" Zelma hesitated. "At my husband's funeral 7 years ago. I played his favorite song, Ave Maria. But that was different. That was private." André and Elizabeth exchanged a meaningful glance. "Mrs. Whitmore," André said slowly, "how would you feel if the world knew what really happened? If your story was told?" Zelma startled. "No, absolutely not. What would be the point?" "It would mean that other young women know they're not alone. It would mean that your talent is finally recognized. And it would mean that Professor Blackwood's reputation is damaged," Elizabeth added. "He's an old man," Zelma said, "just like me." "An old man who may have destroyed multiple careers," André replied, "and who was never held accountable for his actions." Zelma stood up and began pacing around the room. "But how? Who would be interested in the story of a forgotten old woman?" André looked at her directly. "I could tell your story publicly at my next concert." "What?" Zelma went pale. "No, that can't be. That would be terrible." "Why?" "Because," she stopped, struggling with her words, "because then I would have to accept that my whole life was based on a lie. Because I would have to accept that I wasted 72 years. Or," André said softly, "because you would have to accept that you were right all those years, that you really were as good as you thought." Zelma sat down again, exhausted by the emotional intensity of the conversation. "Mr. Rieu, I'm grateful for what you've discovered, but I'm too old for justice, too old for recognition. Are you also too old for dignity?" The question hung in the air between them. Zelma looked at the photos on the wall, images of composers she had once hoped to emulate. "I don't know," she whispered. "I just don't know if I'm strong enough for what you're suggesting." André leaned forward. "Mrs. Whitmore, you've been strong enough to carry a broken heart for 72 years. You've been strong enough to keep your love for music alive despite everything that was done to you. You're certainly strong enough for this. And if I do it, what would that involve? It would mean you finally get the recognition you deserved 72 years ago. It would mean your story inspires other people, and it would mean," André paused, "that you might play for an audience one more time that truly appreciates you." Zelma's breath caught. "Play publicly. I can't. My hands are too old, too stiff." "Your hands moved last night as if they remembered every note," André said. "Music you don't forget. It just waits for the right moment to return." Thaddeus sat down next to his grandmother. "Grandma, maybe this is your chance to finally make peace with the past." Zelma looked at him, then at André and Elizabeth. "And if I fail, if I make a fool of myself, then you stand among friends who respect and admire you," André replied. "But I don't think you'll fail. I think you'll show what the world has missed for 72 years. Zelma closed her eyes and leaned back in her chair. The room was quiet. Only the ticking of the old clock was audible. "I've lived so long with the conviction that I wasn't good enough," she said finally. "I don't know if I can live with the conviction that I was." "But you deserve to try," André said softly. Zelma opened her eyes and looked at him. For the first time since last night, he saw a spark of the determination that had once brought her to the conservatory. "If I do this," she said slowly, "then I do it on my terms. No pity, no sentiment. Just the truth. Just the truth," André agreed. 2 weeks later, Carnegie Hall was sold out again. But this evening was different. The audience felt tension in the air, an expectation of something special. André had announced that during this concert there would be a very special recognition, but had given no details. Zelma sat backstage, her hands resting on the violin case André had arranged for her. It was a beautiful instrument, not as precious as his Stradivarius, but of excellent quality. She had practiced every day for the past 2 weeks, first only short pieces, but gradually longer and longer passages. "How do you feel?" asked André, as he sat down next to her. "Terrified," she answered honestly, "and at the same time excited. I hadn't thought I would ever feel this way again." Thaddeus sat on the other side of his grandmother, holding her hand. "You're going to be wonderful, Grandma." Elizabeth came in with a final update. "The journalists are here, the Times, the Post, the Village Voice. They all want to hear the story." Zelma swallowed nervously. "And Professor Blackwood, did we invite him?" André said. But he didn't respond. "Maybe that's for the better," Zelma murmured. André heard his introduction being announced. "It's time," he said. "Are you sure you want this?" Zelma looked at the violin case, then at her hands. Old hands, but hands that over the past 2 weeks had remembered how to make what they had always wanted to make. "Yes," she said with determination, "I want this." André walked onto the stage and was greeted by the usual enthusiastic applause. But tonight, his opening speech was different. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "tonight we want to talk about injustice, about lost talents, and about the power of music to heal old wounds." A murmur went through the audience. This wasn't what they had expected. 2 weeks ago, I met a remarkable woman in this very building. Mrs. Zelma Whitmore, 91 years old, sat in the balcony and followed music with an intensity that caught my attention. André paused, letting his words sink in. What I didn't know was that this elegant lady was one of the most talented violinists of her generation. What I didn't know was that her dreams had been crushed by prejudice and discrimination. And what I didn't know was that she had lived 72 years with the conviction that she wasn't good enough for the music that meant her life. The hall was now dead silent. André had everyone's complete attention. "Tonight I want to tell you the story of Zelma Whitmore and all the women like her, whose talents were pushed away because they had the misfortune of being born at a time that believed women weren't suitable for certain forms of excellence." André told Zelma's story, her early talent, her brilliant review, the arrival of Professor Blackwood, the systematic discouragement, the forced exit from the conservatory. In 1958, a critic wrote about Zelma's playing. "Here we hear not just a gifted student, but a true talent destined to enrich the American music world." That prophecy was never fulfilled, not because the talent was lacking, but because it was denied the chance. Many people in the audience now had tears in their eyes. The story touched something deep, the recognition of injustice, the realization of what had been lost. "But tonight," André continued, "we want to try to right a tiny bit of that injustice, because it's never too late for recognition, and it's never too late for talent to shine." He gestured to the side of the stage. "Ladies and gentlemen, may I introduce Mrs. Zelma Whitmore." Zelma slowly came onto the stage, supported by Thaddeus. She wore a simple but elegant black dress and carried the violin case as if it were a precious treasure. The applause was deafening, but different from usual. It was full of respect, full of emotion, full of recognition for courage. André helped her to the center of the stage. "Mrs. Whitmore has agreed to play tonight, not because she needs to prove she's good enough, we already know that, but because talent deserves to be celebrated no matter how late." Zelma opened the violin case with hands that now barely trembled. She took out the instrument and placed it under her chin. For a moment she closed her eyes, and it was as if she was connecting with a part of herself she had put away long ago. "I'm going to play for you," she said into the microphone André held for her. what I would have played 72 years ago if I had been given the chance. Bach's Partita in D minor, the piece that once brought me so much joy and that I learned to fear because it became a symbol of my failed dreams. She placed the bow on the strings and began to play. What happened then was magical. The technique wasn't perfect. Her fingers were stiffer than before, her timing sometimes hesitant. But the emotion, the musicality, the pure soul that spoke from every note were breathtaking. This wasn't just music. This was a story of loss and recovery, of pain and healing, of talent that refused to die despite all attempts to suppress it. The hall listened in absolute silence. No one dared to move, afraid to disturb this precious moment. And as Zelma played, she straightened her back. Her playing became more confident, as if the years were falling away, and she was becoming again the talented young woman who had once been going to conquer the world. When the last note faded away, there was a moment of absolute silence. Then the hall exploded in applause, not the polite applause of a concert audience, but the applause of people who had witnessed something extraordinary. Zelma stood there with the violin still against her shoulder, tears streaming down her face, but for the first time in 72 years, they were tears of joy. André came to stand next to her. "Ladies and gentlemen, what you just heard was the sound of talent that is finally free to be what it was always meant to be." The applause continued for minutes. People stood up, crying, shouting, "Bravo!" This was more than a concert. This was a moment of collective recognition of a long-committed injustice. When the applause finally subsided, Zelma took the microphone. "Today," she said with a voice clear with emotion, "I learned that talent never really dies. It just waits patiently for its moment to shine again. For 72 years I believed I wasn't good enough. Today I discover I was always good enough. The world just wasn't ready for me yet." She looked out over the hall at the hundreds of faces looking up at her with respect and admiration. "To all the young women here tonight, to all the people who have ever been told they're not good enough, believe in yourself. Your time will come, and when it does, grab it with both hands." She handed the violin back to André. "Thank you," she said, "for helping me remember who I really am." "Thank you," André replied, "for showing us what courage and dignity mean." As Zelma left the stage, supported by Thaddeus and accompanied by sustained applause, everyone in the hall knew they had witnessed something special. Not just a musical performance, but the restoration of human dignity that had been denied too long. Later that evening, in the quiet of her own home, Zelma sat in her armchair with the violin on her lap. "Grandma," Thaddeus said, "how does it feel?" Zelma smiled, a real deep smile that transformed her entire face. "It feels like I've finally come home," she said. "After 72 years, I've finally come home to myself." 3 months later, Zelma received a letter that would change everything once more. It came from the Manhattan School of Music, an official invitation to receive an honorary doctorate in music, recognizing her extraordinary talent and the injustice she had endured. The ceremony was held on a crisp autumn day, with golden leaves falling like confetti around the campus. Zelma, now 91, walked across the stage with more confidence than she had felt in decades. The auditorium was filled not just with current students and faculty, but with prominent musicians who had come to witness this moment of long overdue justice. "Mrs. Zelma Whitmore," the dean announced, "represents the countless talented women whose voices were silenced by prejudice. Today we not only honor her individual excellence, but acknowledge our institution's role in perpetuating systems that denied opportunities to deserving artists." As she received her doctorate, Zelma looked out at the sea of young faces, students who would never have to face the discrimination she had endured. Professor Blackwood had passed away the month before, never having acknowledged the harm he had caused, but his absence felt liberating rather than disappointing to Zelma. This day wasn't about him anymore. It was about the future. In her acceptance speech, Zelma's voice was strong and clear. "I stand before you not as a victim of the past, but as proof that talent, truth, and human dignity will eventually prevail. To every young artist in this audience, your dreams are valid, your voices matter, and the world is finally listening." That night, at a reception in her honor, André approached Zelma one final time. "I have something to ask you," he said, his eyes twinkling with familiar mischief. Would you consider joining me for a world tour? I think it's time the entire world heard the music that was silenced for too long." Zelma looked at him with surprise, then at Thaddeus, who was grinning broadly. "At 91? Music," André said, echoing the words he had spoken that first night at Carnegie Hall, "knows no age limits. Only the human spirit, and yours, Mrs. Whitmore, is timeless." 6 months later, Zelma Whitmore made her international debut at the Royal Albert Hall in London, followed by performances in Paris, Vienna, and Sydney. Audiences didn't come to hear a perfect technical performance. They came to witness the triumph of the human spirit over adversity. Her autobiography, The Violin That Waited, became a bestseller, inspiring a new generation of artists to persevere against all odds. But perhaps the most meaningful moment came when she established the Zelma Whitmore Foundation, providing scholarships and mentorship for young women in classical music. "I may have lost 72 years, she told reporters at the foundation's launch, "but I refuse to let another talented young woman lose even a single day." As Zelma stood on stage for her final performance at Carnegie Hall, exactly 1 year after that fateful evening when André first noticed her, she realized that some stories don't have endings, they have transformations. Her music hadn't just returned to her, it had found its true purpose. The last note of Bach's partita in D minor faded into silence, and in that moment, Zelma Whitmore wasn't an elderly woman reclaiming lost dreams. She was simply what she had always been, a brilliant musician whose time had finally beautifully come.